My name is Harper Rowan. I'm 34, from Seattle. And the last time I stood in our lake house, it was filled with laughter, mine and Mason's. The next time I returned, it was as the woman he betrayed. He thought I was in Portland on business. She thought her husband was out of town. But we were already there, waiting with wine, silence, and proof. No drama. No yelling. Just the truth. Sometimes, betrayal doesn't need noise. It just needs witnesses. Before I tell you everything, tell me, where are you listening from right now? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Have you ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you? I live in San Francisco now, high above the city, where the cool, damp air carries the scent of salt and possibility. I run a tech hedge fund, a world of complex algorithms, high-stakes decisions, and the relentless pursuit of growth. My apartment, with its breathtaking view of the bay, its shimmering waters a constant reminder of the vast possibilities that stretch before me, is a sanctuary of quiet order. It's a demanding life, yes, but it's real. It's mine. No kids. No spouse. Just me, the quiet hum of my servers, and a life I built from scratch, brick by painstaking brick, far from the small Oregon town where my story truly began. It's a powerful, self-made existence, fiercely independent, a testament to my unyielding will. But every summer, like a relentless tide, an email arrives. A seemingly innocuous message from my sister, its subject line always the same: Brooke's family reunion. And beneath that cheerful facade, the details are always identical. The same beach house in Oregon, a place steeped in generations of family memories, its scent of old wood and lake water a comforting, yet now haunting, presence. The same time, usually a long weekend in July, promising sun-drenched days and cool evenings, the same familiar faces listed as confirmed attendees. But beneath the names of my parents, my sister, my cousins, always one name is conspicuously missing from the actual guest list. Mine. The deliberate omission is a familiar, painful sting. The irony isn't lost on me. I, the one who navigated the treacherous waters of the tech world, who built a financial empire from nothing, am still deemed unworthy of a seat at the family table, an outsider peering in at a party I'm explicitly excluded from. I smile to myself, a quiet, knowing smile, as I delete the email. My shoulders are square, my resolve silent. My clothes, often simple, high-quality basics, are a stark contrast to their flashy displays of wealth, their carefully chosen designer labels. And the water I sip from my simple glass, a symbol of my grounded reality, feels infinitely more substantial than their empty boasts, their superficial conversations. My cousin Lucas, whom I will see at the next unavoidable family gathering, will give me that familiar look, a casual glance laced with condescension that says, "Oh, you came. How quaint." His Rolex, gleaming on his wrist, will catch the sun like a tiny, arrogant threat, a constant reminder of the superficiality they value, the material wealth they worship. My family isn't ruthless in a loud, aggressive way. They smile when they cut you off. They talk about investing and inherited money, their voices dripping with self-congratulation, their words masking a deeper, often cruel, indifference. I talk about actions and spreadsheets, about the quiet, relentless work behind true growth, about the tangible results of dedication. Just not out loud. Not yet. My truth, meticulously documented, remains hidden, a powerful secret waiting for the opportune moment to reveal itself. I wasn't looking for it. Not actively. My world, though often solitary, felt stable, meticulously ordered. I trusted my routines, my carefully constructed boundaries. The day began like any other. The morning light filtered softly through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I was brushing my teeth, the familiar scent of mint filling my senses, the gentle hum of the electric toothbrush a mundane comfort. Mason was in the shower, the sound of the water a soft murmur from the bathroom. His phone lay on the sink beside me, its screen dark. Then it lit up. A bright, insistent glow in the dim light of the early morning. A message notification. My eyes, almost accidentally, landed on the screen. The name was unfamiliar, but the words seized my breath, freezing the toothpaste on my tongue. Can't wait for this weekend. That wine, the lace set. I'm counting the hours. The message wasn't shocking in the way a sudden explosion might be. It was confirming. Brutally, undeniably confirming. It was the final, devastating piece of a puzzle I had quietly, desperately, been trying to ignore for months. Everything I'd been quiet about for too long, his increasing number of business trips that stretched late into the night, his guarded phone, always face down, always clutched tight in his hand, his drifting eyes, perpetually scanning a horizon that didn't include me. The subtle emotional distance that had steadily grown between us, a cold chasm that swallowed our laughter and our connection. All of it. In that moment, something inside me stilled. My heart, which had been a frantic flutter against my ribs, became a solid, icy lump. The air in the kitchen, suddenly thin and sharp, tasted of mint and profound betrayal. I didn't scream. The sound felt trapped in my throat, choked by a sudden, overwhelming wave of disbelief and despair. I didn't cry. The tears were frozen behind my eyes, replaced by a cold, searing clarity. I just knew. With an absolute, undeniable certainty that resonated through every fiber of my being. I knew this marriage, this life we had built, was already a performance. A meticulously crafted script where I was playing a role I hadn't auditioned for, a character oblivious to the deception. And now, the script had been torn apart. It was time I rewrote it. My script. My rules. The past, which I had believed was solid ground, began to unravel in agonizing silence, each thread pulling loose, revealing the rot beneath. Mason used to kiss my shoulder in the mornings, his lips warm, his touch a gentle reassurance. Lately, he barely looked up from his tie, his gaze distant, his mind already miles away, lost in a world that no longer included me. Every skipped dinner, a casual dismissal he waved away with a tired smile, was not just about his busy schedule. Every Thursday night tennis session that stretched late into the night, explained with a vague shrug, was not about athletic pursuit. It was groundwork. Meticulously laid. For her. Claire Donovan. Mid-30s. Her name now burned itself into my mind, a stark, painful realization. I knew her vaguely from social circles, a woman who radiated an effortless confidence, a sharp intelligence. She was married. 10 years, I heard. And now, this woman, this architect of infidelity, didn't just want Mason, she wanted a secret life, a thrilling, illicit escape from her own quiet domesticity. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth, sharp and metallic. Her husband's name? Tyler. An architect. Quiet. Steady. Married 10 years. A man who, ironically, built the very cabin Mason was now using for their clandestine affairs. The visual of him, a gentle, unassuming man, unknowingly building the stage for his own betrayal, made my stomach churn. The nausea intensified as the truth, brutal and undeniable, continued to unfold in my mind. The endless excuses, the guarded phone, the sudden absences, they all clicked into place, forming a horrifying tapestry of deceit. My carefully constructed piece, my unwavering trust, dissolved like smoke. When I messaged Tyler, my fingers trembled over the keyboard, each letter a profound act of exposing a painful truth. His reply came quickly, his voice on the phone surprisingly calm, utterly devoid of the frantic energy I expected. He just said, "Let's talk." And 2 days later, we were sitting face to face in a quiet, anonymous cafe, the scent of stale coffee and unspoken betrayals filling the air. We didn't bring anger. We didn't bring tears. We brought proof. Screenshots of damning messages. Photos. Audio. Every piece of evidence, collected meticulously, silently, over weeks, months. And a plan. A quiet, terrifyingly precise plan. We didn't bring anger. There was no theatrical rage, no desperate need for an emotional outpouring. That wouldn't serve the truth. That wouldn't pierce through their carefully constructed defenses. We brought proof. Cold. Hard. Undeniable. Every message, every photo, every audio clip. each one a quiet dagger aimed at the heart of their deception. Tyler's presence beside me was a steady, calming anchor, his own pain a palpable, yet controlled, force. We set up the cabin like a dinner party. Not a joyous celebration, but a stage for truth. For glasses, gleaming under the soft, ambient light. One bottle of her favorite red, its rich, dark liquid promising something other than pleasure. And a folder. Thin, unassuming, yet heavier than lead, filled with damning evidence, sat quietly on the polished table. No yelling. No screams. Just stillness. A profound, almost sacred, silence that vibrated with the weight of unspoken truth. We adjusted the lighting, not dramatic, not theatrical. Just bright enough for them to see themselves clearly, to see the undeniable reflections of their own deceit. The air was cool, permeated by the subtle scent of old wood and the faintest hint of something metallic, like dawning realization. Tyler's voice, calm and steady, resonated in the quiet cabin, cutting through the heavy air with profound clarity. "They'll walk in thinking this is their story," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the closed cabin door, his face grim. "But it's not. It's ours now. And we're going to rewrite it right here." His words were a powerful vow, a silent promise to reclaim our narratives, to shatter the lies. I swallowed, my throat dry, my heart pounding a fierce, rhythmic beat against my ribs. The silence in the cabin was pregnant with anticipation, thick with the weight of the truth waiting to be unleashed. As we waited, the minutes stretching into an eternity, my thoughts drifted, pulling me back through the long, winding path that had led me to this moment. I thought about how far I had come. From crying silently in our old bathroom, muffling my sobs with a towel, desperate to hide my pain from Mason, desperate to maintain the illusion of my strength, my composure, to this moment. This terrifying, exhilarating moment where I was actively, deliberately, confronting the deepest betrayal of my life. The transformation felt seismic, almost incomprehensible. This wasn't about hurting Mason. Not truly. The desire for vengeance, sharp and seductive, flickered, but I suppressed it. This was about ending the lie. The insidious, suffocating lie that had permeated every corner of my life, poisoning my marriage, eroding my self-worth. I had spent years dimming myself, shrinking my true self to fit into the narrow confines of his expectations, his desires. I had laughed at jokes that weren't funny, their cruelty masked by his charm. I had made endless excuses for the coldness in his eyes, the subtle dismissals that chipped away at my spirit. I had protected him. I had protected his image. I had protected his comfort, always. Now, I was done protecting a version of love that only I was upholding. I was done with the performance, done with the pretense. This wasn't just about confronting his betrayal. It was about confronting who I'd become, trying to be the good wife, the compliant partner, the one who sacrificed her own truth for a fragile peace. It was about reclaiming my authenticity, my dignity, my very right to exist as a whole, uncompromised self. The air in the cabin, cool and still, hummed with a profound sense of anticipation, a quiet resolve that vibrated through every fiber of my being. My hands, clasped tightly in my lap, felt steady. My breath, deep and even. I was ready. At precisely 6:02 p.m., the cabin door opened. The quiet click of the latch echoed loudly in the tense silence. Claire stepped in first, her laughter, bright and careless, floating like smoke in the air, a fleeting sound of their unsuspecting joy. Mason followed close behind her, holding a bottle of chilled champagne, its glass cold and gleaming, a symbol of their celebration. They were a vision of effortless charm, of clandestine passion, utterly oblivious to the carefully constructed truth waiting for them. They froze. Their laughter died. The champagne bottle slipped in Mason's hand, clinking against his ring. Their eyes, wide with shock, scanned the room, then landed on Tyler and me. We were already seated at the table, composed, unmoving, our faces neutral, our presence a silent, devastating accusation. The smile on Claire's face vanished, replaced by a mask of dawning horror. Mason's jaw dropped. The air in the cabin became thick, heavy, suffocating. "Welcome," I said softly, my voice calm, clear, resonating with a profound, unyielding truth. "Wine's open. So is the truth." My words, a quiet declaration, hung in the air, weighted with years of unspoken pain, years of hidden lies. Mason stammered. His face, which moments ago had been filled with carefree anticipation, contorted in confusion, then fear. Claire gasped, a sharp, choked sound. She tried to speak, but only a strangled sound escaped her throat. Mason finally managed to find his voice, a desperate, pathetic whisper. "It's not what it looks like," he pleaded, his eyes darting frantically between Tyler and me, then settling on the folder on the table. I slid the envelope across the table, my hand steady, my movements precise. It was a thin, unassuming envelope, yet it carried the weight of years of deceit. Call logs. Photos. Audio recordings. Each item a damning piece of evidence, meticulously collected, undeniable. "You don't have to explain," I said, my voice soft, but imbued with an undeniable power. "Just read." My words were a quiet command, a refusal to engage in their desperate lies. Tyler, who had been sitting silently beside me, unwavering, then spoke. His voice, calm and steady, filled the tense silence, carrying the weight of his own profound pain, his own hard-won clarity. "We're not here to scream," he said, his gaze fixed on Mason and Claire, on the wreckage of their deception. "We're here to stop pretending." The words hung in the air, a definitive, unyielding truth that shattered every last shard of their carefully constructed illusion. They didn't shout. Not truly. The capacity for rage seemed to have drained from them, replaced by a stunned, horrifying silence. They didn't fight back. Not in the way one might expect. They just fell apart. Claire collapsed into the nearest chair, her face pale, her body trembling, her carefully constructed composure utterly shattered. Mason stood there, a pathetic figure, trying desperately to salvage some shred of pride from a floor full of shattered illusions. His hands trembled as he tried to speak, but the words kept catching behind his teeth, like hollow excuses stuck in a throat too dry from years of lying. His eyes, wide and haunted, darted frantically around the room, searching for an escape, for a way to undo the undeniable truth that enveloped them. Claire turned away from him, her face a mask of profound disgust. Her voice, thin and reedy, was utterly devoid of emotion. "Don't," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet his eyes. "Just don't." Her words were a definitive severing, a silent acknowledgement of his profound failure, his unforgivable betrayal. Tyler didn't say anything else. His quiet presence spoke volumes. He simply rose quietly, his movements precise, deliberate. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a sonogram photo on the table in front of her, its small image a stark, undeniable symbol of a new life. A life that had shattered their illicit bond. Claire gasped, a sharp, choked sound. Her eyes, wide with a profound, dawning horror, fixed on the sonogram. A wave of realization washed over her, twisting her face into a mask of complex emotions, shock, fear, and a dawning understanding of the profound consequences of her choices. Not Mason's. Tyler's. The room fell into a stunned silence. Even betrayal, profound and devastating as it was, could be eclipsed by the arrival of a new life. Not a consequence, an interruption. A shift in the story neither of them expected, a twist of fate that irrevocably altered the landscape of their lives. Tyler whispered, his voice soft, yet imbued with an unwavering resolve. "I'll take responsibility. Not for you. For her." His gaze, direct and unwavering, encompassed Claire and the small sonogram photo, a silent vow to protect the innocent life she carried. His words were a profound act of grace, a stark contrast to the venom and deceit that had filled the room. I felt something then. Not anger. Not pity. A profound sense of quiet relief, of absolute finality. I didn't follow Tyler as he walked out of the cabin, his steps quiet, deliberate. I didn't look back at Mason, who stood frozen, his world collapsing around him. I just stood there for a moment, in the center of the room, where we used to dance barefoot by the fireplace, the scent of burning wood and shared laughter filling the air. Where he promised me forever, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a love I had desperately believed was real. And then I realized I wasn't angry anymore. The raw, consuming rage had burned itself out, leaving behind a profound, aching emptiness that was, paradoxically, filled with an immense sense of peace. I was free. Free from the lies, free from the deception, free from the suffocating weight of a love that was never truly mine. I left my ring in the envelope on the table, its diamond glittering coldly under the cabin lights, a symbol of a shattered promise. Next to it, I placed the photo I had discovered, the one of him with her, wearing the same shirt he wore on our anniversary. A stark, undeniable testament to his profound deception. I left it all there, the proof, the ring, and the last version of myself that needed his approval, that needed his love to define my worth. Outside, the air was cool, fresh, tasting of pine and liberation. Tyler stood by the lake, hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the shimmering water. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Two people. Not lovers. Not allies in revenge. Just witnesses to the same collapse. He nodded once. I nodded back. And then we walked away. Separately. But finally, profoundly forward. It's been a year. A full, transformative year since that night at the cabin. The lake house was sold, its echoes of laughter and betrayal fading into distant memory. I bought a little apartment near Green Lake. It's small, sunlit, and profoundly, wonderfully mine. Its walls are painted a calming shade of green, its windows overlooking the gentle ripples of the lake. It's a sanctuary built on hard-won peace. Mason tried to reach out once. A long email filled with hollow words, mistake, regret, and the utterly disingenuous, "I didn't mean to hurt you." His words, once so capable of inflicting pain, now felt empty, devoid of any power. I didn't reply. Closure isn't a reply. Closure is the profound decision to stop explaining your worth to someone who already saw it and still chose to walk past it, chose to dismiss it, chose to disregard it. Closure is the quiet, unwavering commitment to your own peace. I kept the last photo of us, though. The one of him with her. Not out of sentimentality. Not out of lingering bitterness. But as a stark reminder, even the most perfect smiles, the most charming facades, can hide the most broken truths, the most profound deceptions. I no longer ask, why? I no longer wonder if I could have been more. Because I was never too little. He was just never enough. My worth was never defined by his perception, but by my own unwavering truth. Sometimes silence is louder than rage. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is pour the wine, set the table, and let the truth speak for itself. You don't owe anyone your silence. Especially not the ones who aim to silence you, to diminish your truth, to bury your existence. Have you found your way back from betrayal? Have you built a new life, a new self, after they said you'd come crawling back? Share your story in the comments. I'm listening.